Hello, and today's learning target is I can solve an equation with absolute value. Let's review absolute value. Absolute value measures the distance between the number and 0. What is the absolute value of the following numbers? Well, if we look at the first example here, the absolute value of -6 is 6. The absolute value of 7 is 7, and the absolute value of -18 is 18. So again, just to remind you, absolute value can only be positive, which means it's the distance from any number to 0. So you could be at -18, but the distance from -18 to 0 is still 18 units. Same thing if I were to say what's the absolute value between 18 and 0? Well, it's still 18 units to get from 18 back to 0. So let's take a look at the following equations and solve them. This first one, x equals 2. Well, we are going to set up two cases with absolute value. Because in the first case is as you see it, and we'll drop the absolute value symbols and get x equals 2. The second case that could also occur here is that x could have equaled -2 to begin with in the absolute value bars, but then when we take the absolute value, it always turns positive. So again, there's always two cases. So when I write my answer, I will say x equals, and I could even put my answers in brackets, 2 and -2. Little squiggle brackets around the side, and then circle my answer. So for the second example over here, the absolute value of x equals 6, I can say x equals 6 for my first case. In case 2, the absolute value of that x could have started out being -6. So my two solutions are x equals 6 and -6. So again, you'll start to see a theme that, if we have absolute value, got to make a bracket, there we go. So if you see the absolute value of any number x equal to that number, then that could have been 6 or -6 to start with, so any number and then its opposite in the absolute value. Okay, so let's keep looking at examples. So the absolute value here of r equals 14. So my first case is, I'll just keep my color coding going on. My first case is r equals 14, and then my second case would be r equals -14. So for my answers, r equals 14 and -14. Okay, and here we have a variable p equaling 7. So my first case is that p equals 7. And case number 2 is, p could have been -7 to begin with there in the absolute value. So my two solutions here are 7 and -7. Okay, so now let's look at the next example. The absolute value of x minus 4 equals 7. So again, we always have two cases, and the case 1 is always as we see it, but we'll drop the absolute value symbols. So I get x minus 4 equals 7, and then case 2 is x minus 4 equals -7. So now I'm going to solve here both equations. Okay, and so again, with the second case, I just changed the what was on the right-hand side of the equation, so not the side with the absolute value. And then that could be -7. So what started in the absolute value could have been positive, and then my absolute value turns into 7, or it could have started out being negative, and then it turns to a positive 7 anyway. So let's solve both equations. So I'll add 4, and I get x equals 11 for my first answer. And then over here, if I add 4, -7 plus 4 is -3. So let's double check our answers and let's plug them both back in. So with the first one, x minus 11, and the absolute value of that had better equal 7. Oops, I plugged that in wrong. Let me fix that. So here, the absolute value, I plug in 11 for x. 11 minus 4, the absolute value of that had better equal 7, and it does because 11 minus 4 is 7. So that one works out. If I look at the second case, the absolute value, if I plug in -3 for x, minus 4, had better equal 7, and negative 3 minus 4 is negative 7, and the absolute value of that does equal 7 because the absolute value of a negative 7 is positive 7, so it works out and they equal each other. So my two answers here are 11 and negative 3. Then again, if I wanted to continue to write my answer the fancy way, x equals 11 and negative 3. Okay, let's look at this next example here, and I'm going to set up two cases again. So case 1 is as you see it, x plus 8 equals 7. And case 2 is x plus 8 equals negative 7. Now I'm going to solve both equations. So I'll subtract 8, and 7 minus 8 is negative 1. And then over here, I'll subtract 8, and negative 7 minus 8 is negative 15. So my two answers here, x would equal negative 1 and negative 15. And so I'm going to check my answers. I know I wrote them in and circled it, so hopefully I'm right, but I'm going to double check my answers. So if I plug in negative 1, for x, negative 1 plus 8 is 7, and the absolute value of 7 does equal 7. So this one's correct. And now if I plug in negative 15 for x, negative 15 plus 8 is negative 7, and the absolute value of negative 7 is 7, so negative 15 is also right. So those are our two solutions of negative 1 and negative 15. Let's take a look at a few more examples. Okay, with the absolute value of 2x minus 5 equals 5, I again need to set up two cases. One is I see it, and I drop the absolute value symbols. And the other is that I just change my sign of 5 to a negative 5. That's on the opposite side of the absolute value symbol. And now I solve both of these equations. So I will add 5 to both sides. And I get 2x equals 10. And here x would equal 5. And for my other equation, I will add 5 to both sides. And 2x equals 0. Well, 0 divided by any number is just 0. So I get 0 and 5 for my two answers, but let's check our work. So if I plug in 5 here, 2 times 5 is 10, and 10 minus 5 is 5, and is the absolute value of 5 equal to 5? You bet. Now if I plug in 0, 2 times 0 is 0, 0 minus 5, the absolute value of that is negative 5, and is the absolute value of negative 5 equal to 5? You bet. So I know I'm right in that 5 and 0 are my two solutions. Okay, let's continue again. With absolute value, we always need to set up two cases. So the first one is as we see it. And then the second case is the same, but then we flip the 9 to a negative 9. And now I'm going to solve both of these equations. So 3x equals 3. Last move would be to divide by 3. Then my other equation here, I'll subtract 6. 3x equals negative 15. Divide by 3. X equals negative 5. So my two solutions that I get are 1 and negative 5. But let's double check our work here. So if I plug in 1, 1 times 3 is 3. So I'll write that over here to the right. So 3 plus 6 is 9. And is the absolute value of 9 equal to 9? Yes, it is. And then if I plug in negative 5, 3 times negative 5, and I'll write this down here, is negative 15 plus 6 is negative 9. And is that absolute value of that equal to 9? It is. So we know that we're right. Okay, just a few more examples. So the first case I'll set up is exactly as I see it. And the second case, I will flip and write negative 6 on the right-hand side. And then I'll go ahead and solve these equations. So this is a positive 9, so I'll subtract 9 from both sides and get negative 2x equals 6 minus 9 is negative 3. So I'll divide by a -2. And -3 divided by -2 is 3/2, or 1.5. And then in the second equation, I'll subtract 9, and I get -2x equals -15. So I get some fractions for my answers here. So x equals 15/2, or 2 goes into 15, 7.5 times. So I get x equals 1.5 and 7.5. And I'll close my brackets. And those are my two solutions. Feel free to plug them back in and check the answers so that we know that we are right. And now on number 2, or second example over here, I'll slide over to. My first case is, as I see it, so 4x minus 2 equals 6. And then the second case here is 4x minus 2 equals -6. And then I'll solve my two equations here and get 4x equals 8, divide by 4, so x equals 2. Here I'll add 2, so -6 plus 2 is -4. Last would be to divide by 4, and so x equals -1. And again, please feel free to plug both of the answers back in and check your work. Now that we know how to do that, that will just be a good check to make sure that we are correct. Okay, looking at this next question here, we see that, can you solve this equation? The absolute value of x is equal to -3. Can you solve this? No, you can't. And the reason we can't is because here, this is saying the absolute value of x equals equals a negative number. The absolute value, so I'll write absolute value can never or cannot equal a negative number. Right? So this is never true because the absolute value of anything is always positive. So again, that -3 there, that's no solution. This will never work. I shouldn't say no solution, but I mean there is not a solution to the equation, so no, we can't solve it. That would just be the answer. Can't solve it, no solution. So summary, absolute value takes any number and makes it positive. When we see an absolute value in an equation, there will be two answers. So some steps to follow are: 1, split the equation and get rid of the absolute value signs, and we'll make 2 equations. And then we'll solve each equation as needed, like we did above. And don't forget to check your work by plugging your answers back in. Thanks for listening and have a great day. Bye-bye.